August 5, 1962. A phone rings inside a small bedroom in Brentwood, Los Angeles. No one answers. Behind a locked door, the most photographed woman on planet Earth is lying face down on a bed, one hand still resting on a telephone receiver that fell from her grip hours earlier. By the time anyone breaks through that door, it is already too late. The woman the world called Marilyn Monroe is gone. She is 36 years old. But here is the part almost nobody tells you. The woman who died that night was not born Marilyn Monroe. She was built, piece by piece, frame by frame, contract by contract. Hollywood took a frightened, overlooked girl named Norma Jean Baker and manufactured a goddess out of her. They changed her name, they changed her hair, they changed her teeth, her walk, her voice, even the way she breathed on camera. And once the world fell in love with what they built, the same machine that created her turned around and tore her apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold together. This is not just a story about a death. This is the story of an industry that builds people up like products and throws them away the same way. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Hollywood built Marilyn Monroe and exactly how Hollywood destroyed her. Stay with me, because what happened behind those studio gates will make you look at every star you admire today in a completely different light. Before there was glamour, there was abandonment. Norma Jean Mortensen was born in 1926 in Los Angeles, to a mother who suffered from severe mental illness and a father who was never part of her life. By the time she was a toddler, her mother could no longer care for her. What followed was not a childhood. It was a series of foster homes, an orphanage, and a revolving door of strangers deciding what happened to her next. She later described feeling like nobody truly wanted her, like she was simply passed from house to house, never staying long enough to belong anywhere. At 16, she was married off, not out of love, but because it was the most practical way to avoid going back into the foster system. This was a teenage girl with almost no control over her own life, shaped entirely by other people's decisions. And here is the chilling part. That pattern, other people deciding her fate, would follow her for the rest of her life. The orphanage decided where she slept, her guardians decided who she married. And soon a movie studio would decide who she became. During World War II, while working in a factory, she was photographed for a military morale campaign. That photograph changed everything. A modeling scout noticed her. Doors that had never opened for her before suddenly cracked just slightly. She started modeling, slowly building a portfolio, slowly catching the attention of people in Hollywood who were always hunting for new faces to mold into stars. In 1946, 20th Century Fox signed her to a contract. And that is the exact moment Norma Jean Mortensen began to disappear. Picture a factory floor, except instead of machines stamping metal, it is executives stamping a human being into a brand. The first thing the studio did was strip away her identity. They renamed her. Norma Jean became Marilyn Monroe, a name designed to sound soft, glamorous, marketable. They dyed her brunette hair into platinum blonde. They reportedly arranged for dental work to change her smile. They studied her walk, her posture, the way she held a cigarette, the way she laughed, and they shaped every single detail into a calculated image. This was not an accident. This was an industrial process. Studios in that era operated on what insiders called the studio system, a model where actors were treated less like artists and more like assets on a balance sheet. Contracts controlled what films a star appeared in, what interviews they gave, what they wore in public, even who they were allowed to date. Breach those terms and a studio could suspend you, blacklist you, or quietly bury your career. Marilyn was placed into small roles first, background work, the kind of parts where audiences barely register a name. But there was something happening on screen that the camera could not hide. She had a presence. A vulnerability mixed with magnetism that made people lean closer to the screen. Studio executives noticed it too, and the more they noticed it, the more they leaned into one specific version of her. The breathless, wide-eyed, hyper-feminine bombshell. By the early 1950s, that image exploded into global fame. Films like Niagara, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and How to Marry a Millionaire turned her into one of the biggest box office draws on the planet. Audiences could not get enough of her. Magazines fought to put her on their covers. Men idolized her. Women wanted to look like her. She had become, in the truest sense, a manufactured phenomenon, a product so perfectly engineered that millions of people fell in love with a character before they ever understood the real woman underneath it. But here is the curiosity gap that almost nobody talks about. While the world was falling in love with Marilyn Monroe, the persona Norma Jean was vanishing in real time. And the very thing that made her famous, that breathless, childlike sex symbol image, was also the thing that would eventually trap her. Imagine becoming the most desired woman in the world, and yet having almost no control over your own career. That was Marilyn's reality. Fox repeatedly cast her in similar roles, the dumb blonde stereotype, the comedic bombshell, while she desperately wanted to be taken seriously as an actress capable of complex dramatic work. She studied acting intensely, eventually training at the prestigious Actors Studio in New York, hoping to prove she was far more than the image the studio had built around her. She fought back in ways that shocked the industry. In 1954, frustrated by unequal pay and restrictive roles, she did something almost unheard of for a contracted star at the time. She walked away. She left Hollywood and started her own production company, taking a financial risk that could have ended her career entirely. It was a stunning act of defiance against a system designed to control her every move. The backlash was immediate. Studio executives mocked her publicly, painted her as difficult, ungrateful, even unstable, simply for wanting creative control over her own image. Eventually, she negotiated her way back to Fox, securing a better contract, but the damage to her reputation inside the industry had already been done. She was no longer just a star. She was now seen as a problem. Meanwhile, her personal life was unraveling under the same relentless public pressure that fueled her fame. Her marriage to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio collapsed within less than a year, partly due to his discomfort with the very sex symbol image the studio had built around her. Her later marriage to playwright Arthur Miller brought intellectual companionship, but also intense media scrutiny and personal strain, especially as she battled multiple miscarriages that devastated her privately while she was expected to smile for cameras publicly. Every heartbreak, every personal struggle was consumed by the public as entertainment. Tabloids speculated relentlessly. Photographers camped outside her home. The same machine that manufactured her image now profited from dissecting her pain, and underneath all of it, something far darker was beginning to take hold. By the late 1950s, the woman millions adored was quietly falling apart. She struggled with severe anxiety before stepping in front of cameras, sometimes arriving hours late to set, not out of arrogance, but because of crippling stage fright and insomnia that plagued her for years. Directors and co-stars who worked with her described a woman who could deliver breathtaking performances, but who seemed to be fighting an internal battle no one fully understood. To cope, she increasingly relied on prescription medication, sleeping pills to fight insomnia, sedatives to manage anxiety. In an industry that demanded constant performance, constant beauty, constant availability, pharmaceuticals became the tool that kept the machine running, even as it slowly wore her down. Multiple people close to her later said she seemed exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally worn thin by years of being public property. In 1961, she was briefly admitted to a psychiatric clinic, a deeply distressing experience that she later described as terrifying, feeling trapped and powerless inside the facility. It took intervention from people close to her to secure her release. This was a global icon, a woman whose face appeared on magazine covers in nearly every country on Earth. And yet behind closed doors she was fighting battles in near-total isolation. Her final film, The Misfits, written by her then-husband Arthur Miller, became almost unbearable to complete. Production was plagued by delays tied to her health and emotional state. By the time filming wrapped, her marriage to Miller was effectively over. The woman the world saw as untouchable glamour was, in private, increasingly fragile, increasingly alone. And then came 1962, the year that would end it all. In early 1962, 20th Century Fox cast her in a film called Something's Got to Give. But on set, the same patterns that had defined her career resurfaced violently. She was frequently late or absent, partly due to illness, partly due to the immense personal and professional pressure crushing her at the time. In a controversial move, she also flew to New York to sing Happy Birthday to President John F. Kennedy in a now iconic, breathless performance that captivated the nation and infuriated studio executives who saw it as yet another example of her unreliability. Weeks later, Fox did something almost unthinkable. They fired her. The studio that built her into a global icon publicly terminated her contract, citing breach of agreement, and even filed a lawsuit against her for the production costs lost due to her absences. Picture that for a moment. The same machine that manufactured Marilyn Monroe out of Norma Jean Baker now turned around and discarded her, treating one of the most famous women alive like a defective product to be returned. The professional collapse landed on top of a personal life already in ruins. Her marriage to Arthur Miller was over. Rumors swirled about her connections to powerful political figures, adding even more scrutiny and pressure to an already overwhelmed woman. Friends and colleagues later described her in those final weeks as someone fighting to hold herself together, oscillating between moments of hope about reviving her career and moments of deep despair about whether the industry and the world had any place left for her. On August 4, 1962, she spent what would be her final evening at her Brentwood home. She made phone calls that night, some of which friends later described as sounding distressed, though accounts vary. At some point in the early hours of August 5th, she died from an overdose of barbiturates. The official ruling was probable suicide, though to this day, conspiracy theories continue to circulate, questioning everything from the timeline of events to the involvement of powerful figures connected to her. The world woke up to the news that morning, and it stopped. Within hours, the death of Marilyn Monroe became one of the biggest news stories of the 20th century. Newspapers across the globe ran emergency front-page headlines. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Fans gathered outside her home, outside Hollywood studios, outside funeral homes, many of them weeping openly for a woman they had never met, but felt they somehow knew. Inside the industry, the reaction was a mixture of shock and uncomfortable silence. Studio executives who had pushed her, restricted her, and ultimately fired her now faced public scrutiny over how they had treated one of their biggest stars. Co-stars and directors who had worked closely with her spoke publicly about a woman far more intelligent, far more thoughtful, and far more fragile than the bombshell image the world had consumed for over a decade. Politically, the fallout extended even further. Her rumored connections to powerful Kennedy family figures fueled intense public speculation, congressional whispers, and decades of investigative journalism digging into whether her death was exactly what it appeared to be, or something far more complicated involving powerful men desperate to protect their reputations. Even now, government files connected to the era have been requested, reviewed, and debated by researchers trying to separate fact from decades of myth. Her funeral was deliberately small and private, organized by Joe DiMaggio, the former husband who never stopped caring for her, even after their marriage ended. He reportedly banned several Hollywood figures from attending, blaming the industry itself for contributing to her decline. For years afterward, fresh flowers were delivered to her crypt multiple times a week, a quiet, lasting tribute from a man who watched the system use and discard the woman he loved. More than 6 decades later, Marilyn Monroe remains one of the most recognized faces on Earth. Her image is licensed for merchandise generating staggering sums every single year. Documentaries, biopics, books, and exhibitions continue to dissect her life, her death, and the industry that shaped her. In many ways, the Hollywood machine that built her, used her, and discarded her is still profiting from her image today, decades after her death. But her story did something far more important than generate profit. It exposed, for the first time at this scale, the brutal mechanics behind the glamour of the studio system. It revealed how an industry could take a vulnerable young woman, strip away her real identity, manufacture a persona designed purely for consumption, extract everything valuable from that persona, and then abandon her the moment she became inconvenient. Her story became a warning, a cautionary tale referenced decades later whenever another young star is rushed into fame too quickly, overworked, overexposed, and eventually discarded once the industry decides they are no longer profitable or controllable. Conversations about mental health support for performers, about the dangers of unchecked studio power, about the human cost hidden behind red carpets and magazine covers. Many of those conversations trace directly back to lessons the industry refused to learn while Marilyn Monroe was still alive. Today, when people talk about the price of fame, about how the entertainment industry can chew up vulnerable young people and spit them out once they are no longer useful, her name almost always comes up first. Not because her story is unique, but because it was one of the earliest, most public examples of exactly how the machine works. Hollywood took a frightened, orphaned girl named Norma Jean Baker and turned her into the most famous woman on the planet. They gave her a new name, a new face, a new voice, and a new identity built entirely for public consumption. And when that identity stopped being convenient, when she dared to demand control over her own career, her own image, her own life, the same machine that built her turned around and tore her apart. Marilyn Monroe did not simply die in that Brentwood bedroom in August of 1962. In many ways, she had been disappearing for years, piece by piece, every time the industry decided what she should look like, what she should say, and who she should be. The tragedy is not just that she died too young. The tragedy is that the system that built her into a legend never once stopped to ask what it was costing her to stay one. If this story moved you, if it made you see Hollywood's golden age in a darker, more honest light, make sure you are subscribed and notifications are turned on, because there are more buried stories like this one waiting to be uncovered, and you will not want to miss what comes next.